Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi and welcome back to a special guest episode of That Trippi Show. I'm really excited about this one. Last week when we talked about Project 2025, many of you were surprised at how deep this thing really is going and how far it's gone. But there's a much darker side to all this. What Steve Bannon and the true MAGA believers have always been trying to do is even more far-reaching and authoritarian. In his new book, Finish What We Started, the MAGA movement's ground war to end democracy, Isaac Arnsdorf details what I think is a red alert for democracy. I mean, it is some really amazing findings, and I urge everybody to go out and get this book and read it. It's that important. I'm really glad Isaac could join us today and to talk about the MAGA threat. Isaac, welcome.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Alex, where do you want to get started?
Oh man, there's so much on this one. I think this one's going to be really fun. But Isaac, want to just first of all ask. So, how did you get onto this one? I'm always curious about that.
Yeah, well, I started reporting this in 2021, and if you remember back the early mid part of that year, Trump was kind of out of the picture for a while, right? He was basically in hiding at Mar-a-Lago, and it wasn't at all clear that we were going to be back here with him at as the nominee again. And Bannon really stepped into that void to try to offer the movement some guidance in that period in the wilderness, in exile, of what was going to, how were they supposed to understand the defeat of January 6th and what were they supposed to do about it? And the solution that he presented was, well, it started with an explanation, which was to blame fellow Republicans for having betrayed Trump. And, there's a way in which he's right, that it was only because of a handful of Republicans who didn't go along with it that Trump wasn't able to keep himself in power. So the solution that Bannon presented was that Trump supporters needed to take over the party from the bottom up, and then they could purge and purify the party to make sure that wouldn't happen again. And, with Steve Bannon, he talks about a lot of things, and it's often hard to sort out like what is real and what is just bluster. And so what I started doing was calling around to local party officials in key counties and key states and just asking, was this really happening? Were people really coming out of the woodwork because they heard something on Steve Bannon's show and now they wanted to join their local party? And the answer was actually yes. It was there, and in total, it added up to thousands and thousands of people who were actually doing this. And in the course of that reporting, I met so many of these local party activists and kind of kept in touch with them. And some of them eventually stood out for their personalities and their personal growth over the years and the things that they went through. And that kind of became the book.
The thing that it's one quote that is just stunning to me that is from the book. Bannon believed the MAGA movement, if it could break out of being suppressed and marginalized by the establishment, represented a dominant coalition that could rule for 100 years. I mean, rule for 100 years. I mean, there's only one way that happens, and that is basically getting rid of elections or something. I mean, is that how you took it, or is this? It was so dominant that it would become the majority in the country? Is that what he thought?
So he definitely means it that way. He definitely means it in the sense of the way that he sees it. There is this like ruling elite that is not very many people, but has all the power. And then there's a progressive wing of the Democratic Party that's actually a very small slice of the electorate. And then he thinks everyone else is MAGA. He thinks that 2/3 of the electorate is actually MAGA, and like a bunch of them don't know it yet. So that if the Republicans can get rid of the like traditional, stereotypical country club Republicans and become a working class party and continue their gains with white non-college educated voters, then that would be an actual majority of the electorate that would be able to dominate elections. But, he is also very clear about claiming that the 2020 election was stolen and that they want to change the rules to have elections that are one day paper ballots.
Now, when you say MAGA, Steve's idea of MAGA, what is that when he thinks that millions, tens of millions of Americans are secret MAGA? Is it that working class populist stuff, or is it something else?
It's populist, it's nationalist. I mean, those are both words that he uses. It's definitely right of center, traditional conservative values. And one of the things that I learned in reporting and researching this book that ultimately was like the only satisfactory answer to the rise of Trump for me was that this is a strand of American political culture that has very deep roots. It just was never particularly popular and was systematically marginalized by the two major parties until Trump came along and had the charisma and the resources and the fame to mainstream it. And that's why it was able to spread so quickly and so widely, is because it latched onto something that was latent but was very much there.
We had John Carl on to talk about his Bannon book, where he talked about Bannon proudly turning and saying, "We're Trump Davidians," and it brings me to this point that I think you made, or that someone that you quoted made, that Bannon sort of got that true believers are prone to conversion from one cause to another, since they're driven more by their need to identify with a mass movement than by any particular ideology. And it strikes me then, looking at like sort of what's going on right now in Arizona, on this abortion mess that the Supreme Court there opened up. Is that how? Again, because they more identify as a mass movement than with any particular ideology, that this isn't going to affect them very much. It doesn't. These kind of fights, on ideological fights or on principle, don't really matter to the MAGA movement and to Bannon?
Well, there's certainly a strong constituency of Christian conservatives who care about that issue very much. But you're right that there is
right, but that's not MAGA, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's an element of MAGA, right. But it is not the MAGA movement as a whole is actually less religious in the sense of like belonging and being a practicing member of a church than the Republican coalition pre-Trump. But you're right, Joe, about this idea of like the ideological content being less important than the identification with the cause. And that's something that Bannon learned from this philosopher named Eric Hoffer, who wrote that in 1951, studying the movements of nationalism and communism. And that's part of where Bannon gets this idea that like there are all these people who are MAGA and they don't know it yet.
And it's about turning how ordinary people become fanatics. Is that what is that the crux of what Bannon is trying to implement, or am I getting that right?
Yes, that's the book is called The True Believer, and it's about the followers, not the leaders. And the core insight is that when people are joining mass movements, they're actually subbing out their personal identities with all those disappointments and frustrations in exchange for the belonging that they're craving and a new kind of purpose that they gain from being a part of that from being a part of that movement. And that is exactly the experience of going to a Trump rally, where I meet people who describe it as like going to church for them, and that the excitement of being there is being surrounded by people who they identify with, and they don't feel alone anymore. And particularly in the moment leaving the pandemic, with all that isolation and all that sense of the world turning upside down, that was that power that Bannon unleashed.
That almost gets to something we've kind of been thinking for a while. Like, so when Trump gets up on stage at a rally, and Joe calls it a sledgehammer sometimes, when we talked about this last week about some of the things he says, and the media tends to either, now it's just been normalized so much that whatever he says that's unhinged just kind of washes over. But there's always this question, like, do these people really believe it? And it seems like it's less about convincing them on a policy. I think this is kind of where Joe was going with the abortion example in Arizona, but less about convincing them on a policy and more like giving them validation, feeling like you said, like they belong. And like, it almost doesn't matter. It's kind of like gets to the, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. It doesn't really matter what he says, right? It's what he evokes. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. And you also see this with the stolen election myth itself. It's the machines or it's the mules. And, every time something gets debunked, something else springs up in its place, because like the details don't really matter, right? What really matters is the idea that Trump was supposed to win. And it's like he says in almost every rally, this country doesn't belong to them. This country belongs to you. If that is, it's the same thing he was doing by delegitimizing Obama with the birtherism conspiracy theory. It's about who America is for. And if that's your starting premise, then it doesn't matter what the election results show. The election results, if they contradict that, have to be wrong. And there's a weird way in which, like, actually the lowest common denominator now, the only thing, you asked about how abortion has become a wedge issue in the Republican coalition. Like, actually the thing that unites the Republican coalition the most is the stolen election myth.
During the Dean campaign, we're talking now 20 years ago, Bannon was sort of like watching it. I mean, I would run into him at different debates and things, and he'd be curious. But he back then was talking about, he would talk in terms of it. He wanted to burn the entire forest down because, like, once the forest burns down, then green shoots come up and everything starts over, and you have this new wonderful forest comes up. And I tried to point out that but everything in the forest dies, and it takes 10, 20, 30 years for that forest to come back. And it just seems to me that, and you get to this sort of in your book, that's really still what's driving him, this sort of desire to bring everything crashing down and to destroy the entire establishment, regardless of party or anything, just take all the institutions, everything down and crash it. And I'm just wondering, to what extent have the MAGA followers bought into that idea, or they just don't get it and he's using, or they don't care either. They want to take it all down and burn it and let, and hope something new comes out of the ashes. Is that part of the drive here?
Well, the reason that has appeal is because there's a reality in a political system that isn't serving people's needs very well, right? That's something that's been going kind of a decades-long development of a disconnect between politics and government and what people are experiencing in their lives, and that is what Trump and Bannon together have so skillfully reached out and grabbed onto.
Well, it's like Trump is obviously not a normal politician. Steve Bannon is clearly not what you would consider a regular political strategist. Like, all of this just seems like, and you get to this quite a bit in your research in your book, but he's not just like a political strategist trying to figure out how to win. He's trying to figure out these kind of deep roots and exploit them, I think, is probably a fair way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, the way he put it to me at one point is he's not in the rebuilding business. He's in the tearing down business, and before we can get to rebuilding, that's someone else's job. There's got to be the tearing down part.
Well, I mean, he's actively said, like, I'm a Leninist in that regard.
Well, what he means by that is not that he's a communist.
Right, no.
Again, it's the ideological content is not the important part. What he means by that is about disrupting the established order. And what's interesting, the interesting connection with the movement taking over the party is that was Lenin's innovation, was that you had to you had to put the movement in an institution of a revolutionary party to give it some kind of structure where it could be effective. And that was Bannon's innovation since 2021.
So can you talk about January 6th and the plan and how Bannon played that up and played into it? Or, talk a little bit more about that particular part of the Bannon story.
Yeah, I mean, the way he put it to me was he said, I had no downside. I mean, Bannon is smart enough that he could count and know that Republicans did not have enough votes to throw out the election results in Congress on January 6th. But his audience had to believe that was possible in order to create the kind of pressure to stage such a spectacle that it would undermine Biden's legitimacy from the start. And that is what he was looking to achieve. The problem that created when that failed, when there was that letdown for the movement, was there had to be, you couldn't blame him for that, right? So, and you couldn't blame them for that. So who are you going to blame? And that's how they came up with, well, you have to blame the uncooperative Republicans.
I really like what you pointed out in the book, what he said on his podcast, this is not a day for fantasy. This is a day for maniacal focus. And I mean, some of the language he uses is like, we're coming in right over the target. This is the point of attack we always wanted. Like, it's very, very clear where he's trying to point the movement at this point. Was his goal the whole time to force this confrontation, or was he always trying to, like, at that point, did he not care? Like you said, he had no downside.
Going off of our conversations, what he said is that he had no downside. I'm not sure that even he anticipated the turnout and that things were gonna get violent. But again, when your goal was, as it was for him, just to undermine Biden's legitimacy, there's more than one way to accomplish that. And the way it worked pretty well for that.
Well, you keep mentioning some of the conversations you've had. Take us kind of inside. What were those like? Kind of what was the tone? Was he proud of this? Was he kind of like almost delivering a lecture? Like, what would characterize some of those conversations?
Yeah, he's very smart. He's very well read. He loves to talk about history and his understanding of history, which sometimes resembles other people's understanding of history, sometimes less so. And his idea of kind of our current place in history. And he is unapologetic about and quite candid about how he sees cycles of rises and falls, and that he's trying to precipitate a fall.
And is he? I mean, so he's clearly still has a big hold over the movement and leading it. How do you see his impact? I mean, going into 2024 now, putting this election in sort of the perspective, this close. It's obviously going to be close in a lot of places. Who's the driving force here? Trump or Bannon or the dog that caught the bus? I mean, how do you kind of like see this playing out in this election and Bannon, and what do you see Bannon's role being?
Well, I think Bannon was most crucial in that period where there was the vacuum because Trump was out of the picture. And, so he's less of a prime mover now
right.
that Trump is back and he's the nominee. And, again, Trump is always the leader of the movement. But, Bannon remains, it resembles the dynamic back in 2016 when Bannon was at Breitbart and Trump had the campaign, and like Breitbart was the home of pro-Trump media, but he wasn't officially running the campaign yet. That's kind of back where we are. But, it's very different than 2016. Like, his audience is very different from the Breitbart audience, which was, disproportionately like young and very online. The MAGA movement now is just basically the Republican base. It's disproportionately old, actually. And so there's a way in which, those are more reliable voters. I've observed this, I call it a feedback loop between Trump and his supporters reinforcing each other to become more extreme and more disconnected from the lived experience of the rest of the country. And I don't know how that's going to work in a general election. We can see how that worked in a primary, but a general election could be really different.
Yeah, well, that's something we talked about, the sledgehammer idea that the Trump and Bannon in a lot of ways, and the MAGA movement in particular, it's kind of like it takes a sledgehammer to everything. I mean, on the whether it's the border, whether it's a total ban on Muslims, detention camps, everything's a big sledgehammer that rings the bell for the MAGA base. But in the end, and definitely works in primaries. I mean, not even a close. There's no way. But seems to be in all the elections so far, recently, particularly post Dobbs, seems to that sledgehammer rings the bell for the base, but actually kind of pushes enough people away from the MAGA movement to create whether you want to call it an anti-Trump majority or coalition. But the weird thing about what you're saying is it sounds like MAGA doesn't really care about that. Trump doesn't even really care about that. Bannon, because he believes everybody will be converted, doesn't really care about it. And so it seems to me that's going to be an interesting way to look at this coming November. How's that play out? They're going to turn out for sure because he's going to keep ringing that bell with the sledgehammer. But it'll be interesting to see I guess who's the brains now. I understand Trump's the driving force. I also understand Trump's got, and believe me, he's got much smarter politically. I mean, people around him driving his campaign than he had in 2016. And then you've got Bannon out there pushing as well. But is there any central person in all of this, or is it's just Trump and the sledgehammer, and now everybody's got to go along for the ride, including Steve Bannon?
Well, you've also got a more unified party apparatus behind Trump than you had before. And that provides a measure of discipline that offsets like whatever Trump is going through with his campaign or with his prosecutions. When you have the party, you've got a party that's stacked in his favor instead of like in 2016, where you had a party rank and file that was trying for some time, trying to thwart him in a lot of ways, or had a lot more ambivalence about him. But another key strand of the book is how the anti-Trump Republicans and the Democrats figure out how to use MAGA against the movement, figure out how to message to Republicans who are still Republicans and don't like voting for Democrats, but can't stand these MAGA Republican candidates, and figuring out a way to build a community there and to make the that same search for identification, to find a way to reach out and galvanize these kind of stranded Republicans, which, to be clear, a vanishingly small slice of the party, but one that made a difference in 2022 and very well could make a difference in 2024.
Well, that's something that we, working with the Lincoln Project, we tend to try to go after those specific voters. Do you have any insights as to the best way to do that? I mean, do you have did you, as you went through this and talked to all these people, do you have some thoughts about what is the way to reach out and bring those people in to the whether it's pro-democracy or anti-Trump or side of things?
Well, the way it was explained to me by Sarah Longwell, who's one of the top strategists working on this on the anti-Trump Republican side, and also the group of Democratic pollsters and strategists who are working on this, it's actually very similar to Bannon's formula in that the messenger is the message. It is about putting up people who are credible messengers and who are relatable to the audience that you're trying to reach. And in this case, it's that anguish of, I'm a Republican and that's important to who I am, but I can't tolerate the way the party has changed. I can't tolerate election denial. I can't tolerate these nominees. And so that's kind of there's an echo there to the same way in this low trust, cynical political environment, how the credibility of a relatable messenger is actually like the most persuasive thing you can show a voter.
Yeah, no, Alex and I ran into that in Alabama in the Jones campaign for this when Jones won the Senate seat there in 2017. In the focus groups, these Republican women would talk almost in anguish about how they were hanging by their fingernails off the side of a cliff within the Republican Party because they couldn't countenance what was happening. But they were still so resistant to, for the first time in their lives, having to vote for, and they would spit the word Democrat out like it was poison because they did, and so that was sort of the conundrum they were all in, and we were successful in that campaign of sort of embracing that and bringing them enough of them over that we won in 2017. I think in a lot of ways that's exactly what did happen in 2022 in the midterm. I'm writ large. I mean that what MAGA had become, the MAGA candidates that were out there, it had made enough of them decide to jump off that cliff and take a chance on voting on not voting for the party they'd been in for 30 or 40 years. And I do think there may be some parallels though to like when North Carolina, the gubernatorial candidate there who says he wants to go back to a time when women couldn't vote, and you have Alabama doing the IVF ban, and Arizona now with the Supreme Court there going back to 1864. Some of that same, it's a two-pronged thing. They've got to be reminded of why they have this horrible feeling about the party that they've been in all this time, but at the same time, there's got to be a real effort to embrace them and embrace that and welcome them in, or at least make it acceptable to leave and join against the MAGA movement. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this great moment in the book. It's right after the midterm results, and it's sort of reckoning with why Republicans lost when everyone expected a red wave. And I'm talking to an anti-Trump Republican who's like, well, it's because, this is her perspective, like you nominated crazy people and like regular Republicans wouldn't vote for them. And then I go to Bannon and he totally agrees, but he thinks that it's her fault for not voting for them anyway. And so that's the impasse that the party is. They both agree on what the problem is. They just disagree about whose fault.
We're just about out of time, but there's so much other stuff in this book that I highly encourage people to read. I mean, the one thing that going back through and, as we were prepping for this show, you've got obviously you went on Steve Bannon's podcast to promote this book. And it's not like he is shy about kind of telling people what his model is, right? But I mean, even a lot of his listeners, a lot of the kind of the people in the MAGA movement, I mean, I noticed they were saying, hey, we got to read this. So tell us something from the book that, it might not be apparent right away or something that may surprise our listeners.
Well, I just wanted to write a book for everyone, or anyone. And, that there were going to be people in the book who you would think that you wouldn't like, who you could learn to like. And there's a quote in the book from Thomas Dewey: "Democracy is not just a system of government; it's a way of associated living," something like that, right? The idea that we have to be able to deal with each other as people and settle our differences peacefully and have civil discussions about tough things, and that's how we do it in this country.
So I just want to ask, when the title is Finish What We Started, what is it exactly Steve Bannon wants to finish? What is it exact? I mean, is it burning it all down? I mean, what is that finishing moment in his head, or why did you name it that, and how's that fit?
The title references to a Trump speech, and the idea is picking up where they left off on January 6th and taking power back.
Interesting. So I guess, Alex, do you have anything else? I did want to ask about, are there other people that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, the one we were talking about pre-show, Joe. I mean, and how I think you pointed out earlier in this interview, Isaac, was how he's kind of brought MAGA into the Republican Party, but like a guy like Dan Schultz, who I don't think any of our listeners maybe is familiar with, but like, how does that all fit together?
That's who I was thinking of. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, so I mean, he's the guy who actually came up with this plan that Bannon ended up popularizing when Bannon kind of plucked him from obscurity. And what's interesting about him is, his hero was Goldwater, and he was active in the 90s militia movement. And he had been saying this for years and years and years, and like nobody would listen. And he went around to Tea Party meetings telling them they had to do this, and nobody would listen. And thanks to Bannon, he kind of finally had his moment. So he really represents kind of the longevity and the continuity of how what we call MAGA today goes all the way back for decades on the right, and just never got control of the party until the past few years.
It's a great book. It really is. Finish What We Started, The MAGA Movement's Ground War to End Democracy. Isaac Arnsdorf, thank you so much for being with us today. I think we're out of time, but folks, I really urge you, and we'll put a link in the show notes, but this is worth your time, a lot of insight, and it really made me think about the fight ahead and the best way of bringing some of these people into the fold to vote for the pro-democracy movement and to stop Trump from finishing what he started on January 6th. So thanks, Isaac, for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening to That Trippi Show. We'll include a link to Finish What We Started and a link to the Washington Post excerpt in our show notes. And if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, please like and subscribe to get alerts when we post the next episode. This podcast will always be free with support from our advertisers, and it's part of Resolute Square. So check out the latest at resolutesquare.com/Trippi. Please subscribe to That Trippi Show and leave a review on Apple or wherever you listen. And Alex promises we will get to some of the listener questions in the next episode. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.
Resolute Square.